Okay, it looks like hopefully we are live. Welcome to The Power of Love, the intersection of spec fic and romance. This was one of two possible titles I considered, and the other one was Do You Believe in Magic? But ultimately I went with this one. So we're going to start off with a lightning round of questions for our panelists, just a little bit of an introduction to who they are and what they do. I am the moderator, Sarah Locke. I am a librarian and a romance writer. I write contemporary and paranormal romance. My pronouns are she, her, and let's see here. Let's start with Charles. So real quick, our lightning round. Right now, we're going to do if you write, what is your writing brand in 10 words or less? What is your current favorite fandom? And what is the first fictional relationship you shipped?
Okay. I'm Charles Besur. He, him. Writing brand in 10. Two parts camp, 3 parts angst, I think. Very queer. What fandoms am I currently in? I don't leave fandoms. I've been in the Suikoden fandom for the last however long it's been. I don't think there's been a new game in over 10 years, but that's where I still am. Shipping away. What was the first relationship I shipped? No, that was probably it is probably Suikoden still. It's probably Hugo Thomas from Suikoden 3 back when I was like 15.
Those are the ones that stay with you. All right, so Ebony, would you like me to repeat the questions, or you think you're good to go?
I think I got it. Hopefully, you'll correct me if I miss something.
For sure.
So I'm Ebony, she, her pronouns. My writing brand in 10 words or less is queer Black people making love and seeking joy, which I think is under 10. So I felt very good about that.
Yeah, good job.
Current favorite fandom right now is the Old Guard. I'm every fic that is related to the Old Guard is in my happy place at the moment. And my first fictional relationship I shipped that I can remember, I think, is a Sailor Moon tuxedo mask. Classic.
Classic. All right, Foz.
Okay, hi, I'm Foz Meadows. Pronouns whatever, but most commonly she or they. My writing brand in 10 words or less would be queer feminist fantasy with adventure and romance. The fandom I'm currently most into at the moment is The Untamed, with a side helping of Sleuth of the Ming Dynasty, which is fantastic. Everybody should watch both of those. But yeah, C-drama has been getting me through quarantine in a really lovely way. And the first ship I think I ever properly invested in was either Squall and Quistis from Final Fantasy VIII or Quistis and Irvine from Final Fantasy VIII. Quistis was involved, and the other two were, I think I sort of changed my mind on which one of them I preferred.
Okay, Lee, what about you?
Lee Harlan, pronouns are they, them. Writing brand in 10 words. Queer horror and dark speculative fiction. Sometimes people smooch. Favorite fandom. I don't know what my current favorite would be. Probably the most intensive fandom I've ever been in was probably the Buffy fandom. And first fictional relationship I shipped was definitely Scully and Mulder, but Mulder may have been a stand-in for myself.
You know, you're valid. That is absolutely real. All right, Phoebe, what about you?
Phoebe Barton, she, her. My writing brand in under 10 words would be Punchable Science and Giant Queer Ladies. For the fandom, I would say Fallout, probably. And in terms of ships, I never really had one. So I guess that kind of sets me apart.
And that is like not everybody gets that thing where they hyperfixate on one particular fictional relationship.
Some people are normal, for instance.
Let me have my delusions. Okay, Freya, what about you?
I'm Freya Musk. My pronouns are she, her. So my writing brand in 10 words or less, the Venn diagram overlap between romance and speculative fiction is probably what I'm going to go with there. My current favorite fandom, like Foz, is The Untamed. I watched it at the end of last year, proceeded to infect everybody I knew so that I had someone to talk about it with, and have stuck around in the fandom ever since. It's been a good one. And the first fictional relationship where I can remember thinking what I really want is for these people to kiss is probably Han Solo, Princess Leia.
Very, very fun. All right. So when I first conceived of the idea of this panel, it was kind of a response to the internalized misogyny I had to deal with for so long as a writer, because I spent a lot of time thinking that I didn't have enough ideas to be a writer because all of my ideas involved romance in some way, and my brain automatically categorized that as not real speculative fiction. So I have spent a lot of time unlearning that, and so I wanted to talk with some other people about how these two genres can come together and make something sometimes greater than the sum of their parts. So I'd really like to talk about what is your favorite example of spec fic world building intersecting with romance in a way that like you couldn't with contemporary fantasy, or sorry, contemporary fiction. So thinking, for example, like the soul bond trope that I first encountered in Mercedes Lackey books. Like you can't have that without some sort of a magic system. So let's see here. Starting this time with Lee. What about you?
Steven Universe and Fusion.
Yes.
I think you're muted, Sarah.
Yes, thank you. Fusions are awesome. All right. So Freya, what about you?
I think I like it when the world building around things like politics or magic or religion in secondary world fantasy is used as a mechanism for some of those tried and true fantasy tropes like marriage of convenience. So I think my favorite example of this that I've come across recently is Tasha Suri's Empire of Sand, which is a wonderful fantasy novel with a great romance in it, where the main character is forced to be married to someone in order to limit her freedom, but her husband refuses to violate her consent and sleep with her, which would cement this obedience bond. So the forced proximity plot device is not necessarily the magic bond of marriage, but their shared horror at being put in this situation and the compassion that they develop for one another. So you get a very slow and organic romance, but the setup of it, that really good tropey mechanism, comes from the world building of the fantasy itself. And I really like seeing that in books.
That's awesome. And I was side-eyeing Foz when you said marriage of convenience and secondary world, because I know that she's been working on something. So Foz, what about you? What is your favorite intersection?
Pretty much what Freya said. I love, like, I always love when magic or the spec fic elements can come into it. But the thing that I really love about the intersection of romance and spec fic is just the scope of having a romance with all of this other stuff going on in the background. Like it took me, as you were talking about with internalized misogyny, it took me ages to realize that I liked romance at all, because my primary exposure to it when I was younger was Hollywood romances, which I hated with a burning passion, even as I liked Shakespeare and Jane Austen. And then I would sort of get invested in romances in spec fic books. So like sort of classic reading Robin Hobb or reading Kate Elliott or reading Catherine Kerr, the Devery cycle, and seeing the romances, like the Devery cycle by Catherine Kerr, actually, because it's the spec fic element that comes in there is reincarnation. So you're seeing this entire hundreds of years history of this country that's where the characters are caught in this sort of cycle of fate where they keep reincarnating in different relationships to each other, and that can't really stop until they've figured out their shit. And figured out who they have to be to each other and to right past wrongs, even though there's only one character who endures all the way through and remembers everything and keeps trying to get it to work. I was always really fascinated with that. But yeah, the cultural elements, because I have just written a novel which I'm subbing now, which is literally diplomatic marriage between two men and the cultural reasons for why it's normative for one of them but not for the other, and how that all unfolds. I really love those cultural elements and just saying, okay, we all kind of know vaguely about Earth history. Well, let's make something new and see how we can tweak things and make it interesting, and see, what if there was only one bed for religious reasons, or what if there was only, anything in that, all of those tropes, but make them gay, basically.
And Charles and I were in a panel earlier today talking about favorite queer sci-fi fantasy, and that was one of the things that came up for all of the panelists, I think, was talking about the way that like spec fic allows us to see queer relationships normalized without a lot of the baggage that you have to get with contemporary fiction. Okay, so Phoebe, what about you? Do you have an example of world building intersecting with romance that you like?
This is something I've had to think about pretty hard, and especially in terms of using the speculative elements. One thing I do like is the idea of challenge, or like the romances being challenged by being thrown through unpredictable circumstances, like being like romantic partners being accidentally thrown into the future or into another world and so on. And that the sort of exterior challenge being mirrored by that interior challenge, and how it's a different flavor than anything that you would get on Earth, because there's a fundamental familiarity to anything on Earth that you don't get if you're thrust into the future or another world entirely.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And that really lets the writer intensify the conflict if the external is mirroring the internal. Ebony, what about you?
I am a huge fan of the magic and destiny bringing folks together. I especially love the way that plays out in shifter romances. So that's a huge thing for me, of we are destined to come together, and it's a little bit playing with this chosen one trope too, of we're destined to do this thing, we're destined to do it together. And doesn't that mean that yes, eventually we'll fall together, but that falling, all of the bumps and stuff, really, I enjoy that so much. The little heartbreaks that go along with eventually finding the thing.
Yeah, all the relationship negotiations. Charles, what about you?
A lot of what's sort of been said. I really like the sort of people who are tied in time, sort of having this thing. Jean Marie Brisset had Elysium, which is an amazing book that has the characters who are sort of keep on getting reimagined and reimagined and reimagined, that going on in different iterations and different types of relationships. That's just breathtaking. I really like sort of how magical beings kind of can complicate things. There's sort of Eli Don Johnson has an historical fantasy 2 books whereas one of the characters is a genie, and it's sort of, or a djinn. So there's a lot of weird stuff that gets in with that, with how the magic works and how it sort of limits them, and how the relationship that they're in is can't necessarily be free because there's a central constraint on it. One of them sort of bound to the other one, and there's a lot of stuff with that. And then I kind of and I forget what the trope is called because I haven't actually I like mech suits, throw mech suits in it and a thing, but there's that thing where it's synchronization or whatever it is,
Drift
where they
compatible.
Yeah,
Drift
Drift
compatible.
compatible. Yes, Pacific Rim. Sorry. And so yeah, that one is something that I really like, because it's the two people have to get on the same page. And while that's not necessarily a romantic relationship, there's certainly an aspect of that works in that way.
I think it can be part of a romantic fantasy, that whole idea of being drift compatible and all those variants of a telepathic bond, because it's that ultimate romantic fantasy of being entirely seen and entirely known, and then the other person
Subjecting
loving
oneself
you.
to the mortifying
The
ordeal.
mortifying experience of being known, and the other person loving you for who you are because they have seen you entirely.
Yeah, that's the real fantasy, isn't it? Yeah, so these are all really, really great. And y'all have actually brought up some of my favorites. Okay, so moving forward, how do you, or how can writers, because I'm assuming that most of our viewers are coming from a spec fic background, so but the same kind of strong characterization that you need for a strong plot arc in fantasy or sci-fi can also really inform a romantic arc, like Phoebe was talking about, with the external conflict mirroring the internal. So like, what are your characterization tips and tricks for creating well-rounded, believable, but flawed characters that you can then torment in exciting and new ways? Let's start with Ebony for this one.
Oh, good. This is the one I'm like, what is the answer to this question? I don't know.
Somebody has to suffer.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a little bit it's the like fun of trying to find the pieces that will bring two people together and why things work. I think I often end up writing personally about relationships that are in process as opposed to just beginning, probably because it's a little bit easier when they're already doing the thing, or when they're close enough to already doing the thing, and then it's just figuring out what are the ties that are actually binding you together. And that's sort of the like fun exploration of how do we pull you the rest of the way through. I don't know that I have a tool for that other than just sort of experimenting and hoping for the best.
I mean, that is absolutely a useful strategy. Lee, I know that you're recently dipping your toes into the romantic subplot with Queens of Noise.
Mm-hmm.
So, what about you?
Well, I guess in writing that book, I particularly tried to think about how the characters always inform plot. I mean, that's one of the basic building blocks of writing. And when you're talking about speculative fiction, your plot can be so many things. It can be Were Coyotes having a battle of the bands. It can be spaceships. It can be fairy creatures, whatever you want it to be. But that story has to make sense for the people that you've put in it. And for me, the romantic angle is something that can make that story more personal, more kind of intense, because I feel like there's certain things we feel really intensely. Romance, sex, and horror, I kind of feel like are sort of the big ones in terms of people feeling really, really viscerally. So I do think that putting romance into a world like that and having it be a major part of the story, and not just, as a seasoning of they get together at the end happily ever after, can
Your
definitely make a
standard
much stronger
romance
story.
your standard romance subplot that Hollywood loves to shoehorn in wherever they can.
Right.
Yeah.
And you're like, why these people do they like each other? Like,
It's very much that April Lavigne, like, he was a boy, she was a girl. Can I make it any more obvious? Yes, you could actually.
All right. So, Freya, what about you? What are some ways in which you try as a writer to build those characters?
I think I occasionally do use some of the traditional beats of romance to look at my characters and think, well, if I want someone who's going to have a satisfying romantic arc, what can I put into them at the beginning to make that interesting? And I like writing big argument scenes. So like the big breakup fight is one of my favorite things to write, even though you're going to get them together at the end. So I like to give characters a tender spot informed by their past experiences or their contexts, and get the other character to unwittingly whack that spot as hard as you, the author, can manage in order to create the conflict within the relationship. But then you have to balance that with showing how these people are complementary, that they don't necessarily complete one another, but they enhance one another, and balancing those two of these people are perfect, but they keep accidentally hurting one another on their way to finding out how perfect they are is quite good. I think one of my favorite romances in fantasy is actually Hal and Sophie in Hal's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, in which you've got this incredibly irresponsible person and this person who is resentful of how responsible she's always had to be as an eldest sibling, and they keep clashing against one another. But at the same time, you have magic on board, so you can express these extremes of emotion using the magical world building. There is a chapter called Hal Expresses His Feelings with Green Slime, which is something you can't do in a contemporary romance because one of them isn't a sulky wizard who can create green slime as the externalization of his feelings. So yeah, that's what I try and do.
That's awesome. And for anyone who is trying to write a romance arc and isn't as familiar with the beats of romance, Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes is one of my favorite craft books. It really breaks down like the standard romance or romantic comedy stuff, but also does speak to that characterization part. Charles, what about you?
Well, I think like what you bring to it is this sort of I like writing characters who have like intense trust issues in romances because it's just so much more satisfying to like get them to the point of like, well, how would a character with these trust issues manage to trust someone? And some of that is like, what sort of speculative stuff can you work into there? Oh, someone's like trapped in a force field and needs help getting out. Someone's, there's these things that are going on that they have to deal with, and sort of like going through that or putting it in a place where they experience some sort of bond or have to work together in that way. So like having there be ways that aren't constrained to like non-speculative, like having those speculative tools to sort of be like, well, I can cheat. I can just sort of make this thing happen that's going to make them like go to the place where they're going to have to deal with their stuff instead of just running away from it and running away from it and running away from it. And so that's sort of where I come from a lot of the times when I'm setting up my romance storylines. Is sort of like, well, either, these characters have no reason at the moment to really want to be near each other, and yet they're perfect for each other. They just don't know it yet. So what's going to happen that's going to get them to that point? Is it an alien invasion that they have to fight against? Is it, they both get sucked into an alternate dimension? Who knows? But in figuring that out, they're going to figure each other out, and then things go from there.
Yeah. I really love the extra tools you have to, as Freya said, really have one of the characters poke at the other one as much as possible. Foz, what about you?
So for me, there's sort of two things that I really like. So one of the reasons I always kind of gravitated to romances in the context of fantasy is seeing characters go through something together that doesn't necessarily have an explicitly a romantic starting point. Like if you get these two people thrown together and they're having to survive magical training, or they're having to survive a siege of a castle, or their spaceship breaks down, and you have these two characters who are the only ones who have been there through all of these pivotal moments in the other person's personal development, or they're the person that they have to turn to when they're having an emotional breakdown because that's the only person there. And I love how that can develop a relationship. But I think when I'm writing a romance, something I really love to do, so I have a great love of reading and engaging with sort of like enemies to lovers tropes. But when I'm writing a romance, the thing I love most is having the conflict be external, because I feel like there's been a lot of particularly in sort of YA SFF romance, there was a huge glut for a while of things where the characters were actually, it was meant to be like enemies to lovers or whatever, but they were actually just really awful to each other. And it was meant to be sort of justified on, oh, but they have chemistry and they're both really hot. And it's like, that is as may be, but do they like each other? the answer to which was often, or should have been objectively, no, what with the continual attempts at, murdering each other. So I really like having two characters who, however they get thrown together in the first place, the conflict that they're going through isn't with each other, where they're actually able to communicate and navigate what they are to each other and how that means, but the things they're having to deal with, whether as a shared unit or individually, are external. Because I feel like often in the real world, that's the stuff that, when you're in a relationship, a lot of the time you are dealing with external conflicts. And those sorts of pressures and the pressures they put on you, like speaking from my own life, I've moved internationally with my husband now, I think about 6 times. And even like a small thing like moving, if you ever elect to move house, where you and your partner move the furniture yourself instead of hiring a moving company, that is a very immediate source of conflict, of external conflict on the relationship. And so to me, it's fascinating to sort of process that through a fantastic lens where you have all of this, the big high emotions and the big high stakes that can come from these external circumstances. And it's two people with their backs to the wall trying to figure out how to navigate through that. And then they suddenly turn around and go, oh, you, like you're the person that matters most in all of this.
You need the fantasy version of trying to build IKEA furniture together. That tests a relationship.
Oh, it does.
Okay. Phoebe, I haven't called on you yet, right? Sorry, everybody. I have pandemic brain pretty hard right now.
So what I was thinking is that the speculative stuff allows things like literalizing the metaphor, which can be really instructive when you're writing a romance or something leaning that way. Like I haven't done much. I've started like poking at it, but it's just like in what I've done, it's like take the whole big intense relationship and literalize that by having one of them literally be 20 feet tall, which is an interesting speculative element in its own right and demands a lot of world building in its own right, but also makes a lot of things possible that wouldn't be in a strictly contemporary lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pause for a moment because we have a question from Discord. Someone is asking about special considerations for writing polyamorous romances. Has anybody here dipped their toe into that at all?
Sort of.
Fun.
So not so much a polyamorous romance as the main focus of a thing, but when I was writing my Manifold Worlds duology, the secondary world setting of Kenna has polyamory as normative. So so you had background characters who had mentioned having, 2 wives and a husband, or there was a character who in the second book was developing, he already had a relationship with a woman, and then he met a man. He's like, oh great, I get to introduce him to her, and that going on in the background. But I think one of the things that's most important with it is culturally situating it within the context of the imagined world. So is it normative in this setting, or is it not normative? If it's normative, in what parameters are it normative? So if you look at, like, for instance, Utah, it's normative in the sense of being polygamy, i.e. one man with many women in a particular context. But you can just sort of go, well, fuck that, I'm going to have a reverse harem situation where it's one woman and many men, or you can just queer it up and have everybody with everybody, but you can put different parameters on it. So I think apart from considering the balance of personalities, because that's always going to get more complicated the further. So in my setting, it was, the idea is, yes, no partner can, the whole point of it being polyamory being normative was not everybody can be everything to the other person. So the point of having the many bond marriage is that you bring in other people who are useful to you as a group. So not every aspect of the marriage is romantic. You'll have romantic partners and people who are platonic within a marriage and who will contribute in different ways. I think it gets more complicated the more people you add to it in any one of those contexts. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Charles, were you raising your hand?
I mean, I think it was just touched on, that sort of like idea that when this happens, it can take a lot of different forms. And I know when I've written some things, it's like, well, polyamory can overlap with other things, especially with like queer romantic or non-romantic groups, where it's like you can have many people who are partners in many ways, and this includes like aromantic romance and things like that, where it's something where it builds in slightly different ways, and a lot of the times it does sort of like people helping people and how that works, and you just sort of have to make sure that it works and works for everyone, like not that there isn't someone that's just sort of like tacked on or a servant in that situation without wanting to be in that place. So
Yeah.
A really good series of books that have polyamory as kind of a normative thing are the books of the Raksura by Martha Wells, which I need everybody to read so that I have more people to yell about them with. But that's like queer polyamorous dragon shapeshifter people fighting slightly eviler dragony shapeshifter people in this amazingly fantastic world setting, and sort of dragons as like a hive society, and it's really amazingly good. But yes, everybody should read them.
I think you can also use that intersection between poly and fantasy to show a disruption of the status quo. So you make a decision. Do I want this to be normalized and part of the background, or do I want it to be something that maybe is a bit unusual? And if I'm writing, magic comes from the dyad of two people acting together, what happens if you throw in somebody else? If the magic between a queen and the land is dependent upon the marriage, what happens if the marriage involves more than two partners? And things like that. I wrote a book last year, which is currently in a drawer needing revision, but it had a central triad romance where there was poly in the world building, but not for these particular people. And how did that intersect with the kind of magic they were trying to wield?
Mm-hmm.
It was fun.
Yeah, I think that the thing about polyamorous romance, in my experience of writing it, is that it's just you have to realize that it's not just like a straight linear progression. It's like you have two people, okay, you add one more person, so that's like one more person's worth of communication, because in most cases you are adding not one additional relationship, but a multiplicity of connections, and how all those people interact has to be considered and has to be shown. And that can really contribute to your characterization and your plot and your conflict. Okay, it looks like we're actually going to have time for the optional question I came up with. So yay! And we've probably touched on this a little bit in our talking about like world building, magic and tech intersecting with romance. But we're going to talk about our favorite speculative fiction trope and our favorite romance trope, and why those are our favorite. So, Freya, I'm going to start with you this time.
I've already talked about marriage of convenience. Okay, I'm going to say that I do really love enemies to lovers if it is done well. And I think one of the problems that Foz talked about is that if you have a short amount of time, and especially in something like a YA novel where you only have quite a small word count, to get people realistically, or at least convincingly, from we hate each other and are trying to kill each other to here is why we're perfect for each other and are married now, yay, is very difficult. You just don't have the space to do it. I think fan fiction can do it well because you don't have to do all the background yourself. Everybody's coming into it with a lot of inbuilt knowledge, and so you're starting halfway through, and so you can get the characters the rest of the way there without having to put in the work, which is a bonus of fan fiction. I think C.S. Pacat's Captive Prince trilogy does it quite well, and that's because it took 3 books, 3 quite long fantasy books to get from the enemies to the lovers. And I think all the ones that I've seen of it doing well occur over a long, possibly serialized story. I don't know, as to why I love it, I think I like that intensity of emotion that it brings, and that you really do have to watch the writer and the characters putting in the work to overcome barriers and obstacles and find out why they might be perfect for each other. My favorite speculative fiction trope is not really related to romance per se, but it is what I think of as anthropomorphized habitats with attitude. So I really love a magical house so much, or a sentient ship as well. I think anything with that interaction between your environment and yourself that is then brought to another level by magic or technology is something that I'm completely weak for every time.
Yes, love a magic house love a good AI, especially if they're snarky. All right, Phoebe, what about you?
I've been thinking hard about this and I couldn't really think of anything, but I have to just second the whole possibility, the romance possibilities of genius loci in that sort of, in any sort of situation.
Yeah, there's a lot to play with there for sure. All right. So you didn't really have any favorite spec fic tropes you wanted to talk about?
Unfortunately, no.
Absolutely fine. Lee, what about you?
Well, like Freya, probably my favorite romance trope is really any variation on enemies to lovers, friends to enemies to lovers, rivals to lovers. I love all of that. And yeah, I guess it's just the intensity of it, and I don't know, that just kind of delicious tension of, you know, that there's something there, the chemistry is there, and especially like friends to enemies to lovers, they have the history, but something has happened, and just waiting for the conflict to resolve as well as the romantic tension to resolve is just so much tension building in your chest where you just want to shake people. Favorite spec fic tropes, I really love generation ships, because I like that kind of microcosm of building a society of just these people who are completely isolated. I love a closed room murder mystery, but in space. And anything that uses the trope of humans will pair bond with anything, whether that be a robot or a fuzzy.
I'd be the Roomba.
Yes. Or the Roomba or whatever. I just love it no matter what.
Abby is a gift. Foz, what about you?
Okay, so I am an angst lord. So my favorite romantic trope is like hurt comfort, emotional hurt comfort. Give me all of the wump. I am absolutely weak every single time for character who has been suffering and just really going through some stuff and has been managing and nobody has noticed, and then somebody does notice, and that's the person who's like, oh shit, no, you actually need a person, and then they have to navigate a relationship out of the feelings that come up. Yeah, I love that. It's my absolute catnip. Spec fic trope, ancient civilizations. Whether in space or in a fantasy setting, that whole like the 7-year-old me who wanted to be an archaeologist. Just that idea of, oh, we have to uncover the secret magical / technological mysteries of the past, and we don't know who our forebears were, and we have to go rooting around in ancient tombs, and oh, look at this giant alien relic that's here, or these giant bones jutting up from the land, and we don't know where they came from, and there's this fundamental mystery that's all about culture and identity and heritage and history, but it can also be really personal for the people investigating it, like that. Yeah. I love that.
Absolutely excellent. What about you, Ebony?
Romance wise, fake relationships is always a fun time. You gotta love when people are like, you know, this shouldn't work. I don't really want to be with you, but let's pretend. And, you know, if it becomes real over time, I guess we'll work that out eventually. I think that's always just so much fun. And then spec fic trope, controversially, is the chosen one, as long as the chosen one is not a cishet man. So I'm thinking like Trail of Lightning, Rebecca Rowanhost, that whole Sixth World series is like, yep, you're the chosen one. You're not the one we would have thought probably if we were talking about traditional chosen one. And I still love that. I talked about like I like the idea that destiny is playing a big role in what's about to come, and I think using that is always fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, fake relationship. I don't do any of them ever go into it expecting like real feelings to come out of it, because it really doesn't seem like it. Clearly,
I never
no
do,
one
and it's
has.
the most satisfying when you have no idea that this is the person.
Absolutely. Charles, what about you?
So like spec fic tropes, I like mech suits. Like give me mech suits doing basically anything, and I will be there for it. Sort of like also like sports AU, I suppose. Like throw those together, and that is my thing. Like people competitively doing sports in mech suits. But like romance wise, I want to be like the introvert and the bi disaster that just get thrown together and have to figure it out from there. I think that's like what always gets me. It's like the bookish one who wouldn't do anything that's pulled into this adventure with this swashbuckling like mess. So I guess sort of odd couple.
You just described my marriage, by the way.
I think we all know which one you
I'm actually
are.
wearing my chaotic bi shirt.
But yeah, no, we absolutely need more bisexual disaster characters everywhere. Okay, so we have a question, and somebody was asking, what can we do more as a community to welcome more romance writing and writers, especially with the RWA implosion that was somehow just this year? Does anybody have any suggestions or comments that they'd like to make on that?
All right, things are exploding in my room.
I think just be aware that we're all in genres that have been, put down in some ways, and that romance people are not a strange and whole other separate series of beings. Like lots of the people I know who read spec also read romance, and vice versa. It is about, on some level, digging out that misogyny that says these stories are girly stories and are not worth telling, which even those of us who read romance have carried around a little bit from childhood. And I think just be aware of the really good speculative work that is being done in the romance genre. So people like KJ Charles, who write historical fantasy, people who are working in the paranormal romance genre. There's a lot of amazing speculative stuff going on. And if you're someone who reads fantasy and science fiction and thinks, oh, I really like it when the romance arc is done well, you would probably enjoy it where that balance is tipped just slightly the other way. And the focus of the story is the romance, but there's some amazing sci-fi and some amazing fantasy going on at the same time. So don't be afraid to go looking for stuff that you think you would like and then be loud about it.
Absolutely. Did anybody else have any commentary on that? I see we have about 10 minutes left.
I think just to say, to back up what Freya said, there was certainly a period in my life where I would have sort of turned my nose up at anything that was explicitly labeled romance, even though I was loving the romance in that I found in other things that weren't branded romance. And I think it comes down to this sort of separation between romance as genre and device, because you can have something like romance as a device within the wider context. And I just sort of think that people, even if they like that, will shy away from something like, because almost every TV series or movie at some point, as we were talking about, will have romance either shoehorned into it or developed throughout it, particularly straight romance. And I think an advice to say is just, if you're happy with romance as device, then consider that you might also like romance as genre. You're just not used to seeing it packaged that way.
Yeah, and honestly, if we're going to be super real about it, most romance writers are going to handle that romance arc a lot better than rando Hollywood guy who decided that these two people have to get together because he's a guy and she's a girl.
Yep.
All right, so since we're coming down towards the end, we're going to do our final lightning round. So we talked at the beginning about your current favorite fandom. So if you have a current ship that you're shipping, tell us a little bit about it and why it's awesome. And also, we're going to do your favorite underrated book that you've recently read. And this can be a spec fic book, romance, or both. So, all right, let's see here. I'm going to start with Foz this time.
Oh, damn.
Everyone suffers.
Okay. So I was saying before that the show that I'm really engaged with, or the fandom I'm really engaged with at the moment, is The Untamed, where the primary romance is between Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji. And that is an amazing sort of slow, like it's technically not explicit on the page, on the screen because Chinese censorship, even though the novel that it's adapted from is explicitly queer. But it's this amazing sort of long game with everything in it. Like there's pining, there's somebody coming back from the dead, there's political shenanigans, there's an evil flute. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on there, and it's amazing. But I think talking about sort of like an underrated book, I mentioned them earlier, but I'm always going to be waving the banner for the Books of the Raksura by Martha Wells, because I know that everybody really got in, well, a lot of people really got into Martha Wells with the Murderbot books, which I also love to death. But the Books of the Raksura are so, like, at least once a week, I think about rereading them. Oh, sorry, the Discord group is apparently excited about my cats wandering around in the background because they're being fed right now. But yeah, I'm just constantly in love with those books, and like how lush and beautiful the world building is. The magic is just, it's just unlike anything else that you've read. The gender politics of it are amazing. It's queer, it's poly, and it's just fundamentally kind. Like the driving emotional impetus of those books is, what if we were kind to each other, and what if people who were damaged found a home, or not damaged, but people who've been cast out found a home, and what if you were hurt and you got healed? And it's just this really, the whole impetus of them is finding a family and finding a community and building a place. Both, it has like the genius loci stuff that Freya and Phoebe were talking about, because it's very much, we have to build this magical home and something is missing from it in one book, and we need to go and find this to literally bring our magical mountain tree alive so that we can live here. And it's just real, they're really special. They've got everything, and everybody should read them.
Absolutely. All right, Ebony, what about you?
Yeah, I mentioned the Old Guard earlier, and I am super intense about the throuple that is Jo, Nikki, and Booker. I am just very satisfied by everything I read that features those three people together. In terms of favorite underrated book, I'm sort of going to cheat and say the Welcome to Seaport series, which is by Katrina Jackson, and his romance is really, really good. It features polyamorous relationships, queer couples. It's got a little bit of everything for everybody. There's a secret child of a mayor who has died recently. It's very dramatic, and I love it very much. And I think it's a great set of books. And then the other one I wanted to mention, because Freya mentioned them earlier, is KJ Charles's Magpie Lord series, which is just so good. Just
so good. Everything KJ Charles writes is amazing.
Yep. Magic used as sex toy.
Yes. Forever and always.
Magic tattoos that transfer from one person onto his boyfriend because they've decided they like him better.
Wow, that's rude, honestly. But amazing. All right, Lee, what about you?
Latest ship, it would be a tie between Catra and Adora, and Harrow and Gideon from Gideon the Ninth. Both enemies to lovers, and then Gideon and Harrow also manages to be fake relationship, and opposites attract in specific ways. Favorite underrated book, Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon, which one of my favorite tropes, generation ship, also dark as all hell, and has I think a really interesting queer romance at the, I don't know if you say the center, but sort of the center, close to it.
Awesome. Phoebe, what about you?
Great, we'll be really quick. So for ship, I really love, like going back to Fallout, the female soul survivor, and Kiri, because she's such a cinnamon roll. And underrated book, it's really, really very good. Something that made me cry, something that people here might know, on Accident of Stars by Foz Meadows. So I would definitely recommend that. And yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we are coming down to the wire. So real quick, Freya.
Well, I won't talk more about the central relationship of the Untamed because Foz covered that. I will say that it is a very good disaster buy meets introverted scholar pairing, if you're into that. The book I will recommend is Sing for the Coming of the Longest Night by Iona Dat Sharma and Catherine Fabian. It's a novella set in a magical contemporary London where the two metamors of a poly-V relationship who do not get along have to go on a quest for their mutual boyfriend who has gone missing.
Nice.
It's very like casually and comprehensively queer. It's great.
Okay. All right, Charles, we have 1 minute, but apparently the Discord is very enthusiastic if y'all would like to drop in after the stream self-destructs.
Okay.
My ship is like the entire Suikoden setting, so I don't like limit myself to one because I'm like one of the few people writing in it, so I have to be everything. Underrated book. I mean, I mentioned Elysium before. It is an amazing book. I would recommend everyone go and check it out.
All right, and I'm just going to go ahead and throw in my underrated book plug for Deal with the Devil by Kit Roca, which is a pair of authors writing post-apocalyptic romance and political drama, I guess, but it's got a little bit of something for everyone. And if you're a fan of super soldiers in your fiction or mercenary librarians, I recommend you check it out. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for talking with me and sharing the things you love. It was so much fun. And I thank you to the audience for being here with us. Bye.